Hi guys, this is Max from makeitconscious.com. I hope you're doing very well today. Now, today I'd like to talk about the path of individuation. Having discussed over the last few days about what individuation is and why a person might be interested in actively moving towards this goal, today I'm going to talk a little bit about the means of doing that. And it's important to preface this by saying that individuation is a natural process. This unfolding of moving into our true selves, this is something that does happen naturally by virtue of our higher self moving us into situations which are going to challenge us. So this forces us to grow. But that said, what we might call the lower self, the ego, exists as a way to help us survive and help us maintain social belonging. And it is operating off a whole set of conditioning which has been born out from pleasure and pain throughout our entire lives, and also what we might have inherited as part of our DNA. So this is a process that happens, and it's a process that people follow and embark on without necessarily realizing it consciously, and maybe without following any particular practice consciously. However, they will be doing things that are akin to a path, perhaps without actually realizing it. So they will be, for example, growing wisdom as they grow older and encounter new experience. They'll be actively using experience to turn into wisdom. They will be abiding by a certain moral conduct. So they're not likely to be going around killing and stealing, for example, because that is very non-conducive to integration. And lastly, they're likely to have some kind of mental discipline. And all of these facets of their approach to life will have been borne out by the challenges they faced. So whilst they may not realize that they are on an individuation journey, they might not call it that, they will have come up against challenges that have compelled them to behave and think and operate in a way that does move them along that path. Perhaps it's through relationships and personal life, through work. It's probably from every corner of their life that's doing this. And likewise, there are many people that follow spiritual traditions that also teach and encourage the practice of things that push people towards individuation. And they might have their own goal, and they might call it something else. They might call it enlightenment, they might call it the Holy Spirit, they might call it moksha, so on and so forth. And what I believe is that actually all of these processes are pointing towards the same thing, which is the attainment of wholeness. Now, Jung referred to this feature in Jesus Christ, and he said that, I'm going to paraphrase Jung slightly here, but that the main lesson to be learned from Jesus' life is not that he became this wonderful, loving person per se, but that he is an example of someone who became who they were meant to be. And that's a really important thing to take away as we bear this in mind, because it's not possible to individuate by trying to be someone else. The whole point of individuation is to grow into our true selves, become whole and integrated in our experience and in what we call the world. And so Jung coined the term. However, Jung does not offer the practices that one would need to attain to individuation. So whilst I personally feel that Jung was probably the most profound psychologist who ever lived and did probably more for the field than just about anyone, and that is saying something. He gave us the model of the mind. He understood the mind with a kind of intricacy that I simply haven't encountered anywhere else, not even in Buddhism. And that said, there are aspects of these Eastern traditions that go back 2,500 years, probably substantially longer in Brahmanism, and we don't actually know how far back that goes because they didn't really record things by date in those times, so who knows. But the point is that these are ancient practices that have yielded demonstrable benefits to the minds of anyone who practices them. And they include the mental discipline aspects, and they do include the ethical conduct as well. However, a lot of these practices were born in a era where people thought about the mind, have thought about existence in quite a different way, and have come from a very mythic paradigm. And so what can happen if we then bring these paradigms into the modern age is a number of things. Well, first we have to reconcile that with our other modern understanding of the world and things like physics and mechanics and biology and chemistry. And they can be some very difficult things to reconcile. And so what often ends up happening is we try and shoehorn in these ancient teachings into our modern understanding and say, oh, well, obviously they were, no, this means that, and so on, rather than actually just using modern understanding and taking what worked from the old traditions. So there's an element of perhaps idealization and glamorization of these older practices, and we assume that perhaps because they weren't invented in the modern age, they must be absolute truths. Now, this is something that Jung understood very well. He understood how this comes about because he understood the nature of the mind very well. And that actually, a lot of what was taken literally in these traditions, all of the major religions and the rest, are actually symbolic. And they're symbolic of something that maybe exists to all of them. And so we make a great mistake when we assume that, when Buddhists talk about Mara, for example, they literally mean an actual being who comes and tempts us and does a lot of evil in the world. And people who adopt this view are actually missing out on one of the greatest opportunities on the path to individuation, which is to understand the unconscious and reclaim the projection. So that said, the tools given to us by the Eastern traditions are all extremely efficacious when it comes to attaining a highly integrated mind. And this is largely because they work off a principle of making the unconscious conscious. So in Buddhism, for example, you have the Eightfold Path, and every step on that path, knowingly or not, actually works off this principle. So for example, if we choose to speak kindly, what that's doing is it's actually prompting us when we feel compelled to speak harshly, we stop ourselves and we go, well, I'm going to practice speaking kindly and see what happens. So there's that experience aspect, but it also forces us to look at our motivation, at the unconscious driver, what's going on there. And in doing so, we make it conscious. We become more aware of what's going on inside our own minds. That creates understanding, and that leads us to becoming more integrated. So on Jung's side, we have an extremely intricate model of the mind that includes a vital concept, which is the unconscious, both the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. And this model is absolutely necessary if one is to truly attain individuation, because it fully explains what's going on in the mind, or at least explains it to a sufficient degree that we can understand and apply this model well. On the other hand, the Eastern traditions bring on board a practice that extends not just to the understanding, but into how we can conduct ourselves in daily life, how we actually interface with the external world in a way that brings forth what's holding us back, and crucially, the mental discipline aspect. So this path to individuation, I've subdivided into 3 cornerstones, which is an inspiration very much taken from the Buddhist Eightfold Path. This is the cornerstone of understanding, the cornerstone of conduct or behavior, and the cornerstone of mental discipline. And those 3 cornerstones subdivide further into 7 habits. And so over the next few days, I'm going to be talking about, in a little bit more detail, these 7 habits for a highly integrated mind. And this is the way of life I choose to adopt as a way to move my mind forward. And it's very much made for a modern context. So while some of the Buddhist teachings, for example, might teach something like right livelihood, which talks about not selling living beings and not dealing in meat, basically, not selling poisons. I would hope that I maybe don't need to spend too much time encouraging my listeners to not sell poison. A more useful piece of guidance I'd like to give in this modern age is a habit I call contribute your unique and specific value to the world. And so this goes a little bit further and it's a bit more proactive by way of saying, if you actually go out there and give what you can to the world, then this is an extremely powerful habit to adopt. as a way to improve the state of your own mind. So that's just one tiny snippet, but like I say, I'm going to spend the next few days going over these in a little bit more detail. And so for now, I'll leave it there. Hope that was useful, guys. I shall chat to you next time.